fellows on the Thinking Fellows. So, no further ado, Mr. Keith.
We're going to see if I can select the right HDMI, and then, oh, look at that. We're good. Well, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
It's good to be here once again. I think this is like my fourth or... Oh, thanks. It's like my fourth or fifth time here, so I'm happy to be here at Redeemer Huntington Beach, and I've got a new presentation for you guys, if I can get my computer to stop freaking out. And it's titled, You Need Your Church and Your Church Needs You. So I've been working on a problem, which is the decline in regular church attendance amongst Christians. And the reason I've been working on this is, if you've been paying attention to any Christian media for the last decade or so, we've probably all heard about the rise of the religious nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not of Catholics in convents, but of people who have no religion or religious affiliation. A lot of people, a lot of churches, a lot of theologians, everybody has been talking about this for about a decade. And that's because in 2015, a Pew Landmark survey, which is just like a total compilation of all the data they do on a particular topic, came out on religiosity and religion in the United States. And in 2015, for the first time in one of those studies, you could like just really see the decline in Christianity, especially in Protestant Christianity in America. And then you could see the shift as to where these people went, and it wasn't other world religions for the most part. It wasn't even atheism per se. It was just this religiously non-affiliated, which then you could do that. And a lot of ink has been spilled on this. A lot of podcast and video time has been spilled on this, and so we keep up to date with this, those of us who have talked about this issue. And I noticed something in the revision to this survey that came out last year. So in 2025, they did another landmark, which again is, when they use the word landmark, it's just a summary where they slap together all the different surveys that would be of this nature. So you might have one that's like on Protestant church attendance in America or something like that. Or you'd have another that is on, say, spirituality in America. And they just combine, let's say all 100 surveys or whatever the number is into one big piece of data with some conclusions there for you and things like that. And I noticed a stat that I didn't think anybody had really talked about, which was the rise of the Christian, the self-declared I'm a Christian in these surveys, who doesn't go to church. And the increase there, and I'm still...
You know where to get that?
Where to get?
How to fix that? Easiest way is come up here
I could have sworn
to mirror. Let's see, where is the mirror?
It's like it's because I selected this window when I should just do the whole computer.
Well,
Because I don't
just go down
here
to...
it is.
They buried the mirror.
Yeah, choose content.
Let's just do entire screen.
Yeah. Or you, okay.
I don't have anything to hide. Should be fine.
Okay.
It should be fine. We don't, till I get some crazy text message in here. Okay, so here's my slides. You can tell I'm new to slides. I was telling the guys at this table, I'm not very old, but I've been lucky to have been presenting and teaching for about the last 10 years. Redeemer was the first place I ever got to try this out, so it's great to be back. But I decided to do slides this time around because I found out people really do love slides. They love the pictures here. And so we're going to do slides. So what did I find that was just tucked away in like one little line in this survey? It wasn't even really apparent. 51% of Christians do not regularly attend church. And then this was a picture of a church that got all reformatted. So, but yeah, so 51% of Christians do not regularly attend church. What does that mean is, well, people who answer these surveys for Pew who are willing to say to the surveyor, I am a Christian, I share the Christian faith, whatever sort of that means to them, will then answer in other surveys or in that same long survey that they don't regularly go to church. What does Pew consider to be regular? It's once every other month or more frequently. Okay, so this is in-person attendance. So you're talking about 6 times a year would be considered regular in these surveys. Yeah, so we're already hitting that's a pretty low standard, right? 6, yeah, So 6 times a year would be considered regular. So we're already missing the mark on a pretty low number to begin with. Why? Well, we might all know why this is kind of a problem, because we can kind of look around in our churches and realize that we have been seeing decline in regular attendance across Protestant denominations for the last 20, 30 years, and this might explain some of it. And I also think this is an important number to look at, because if we pair it with data that, my dad hasn't been here recently, has he? But he's been here in the past. And if you guys have met him, Dr. Scott Keith, his last book, his first book, I think a decade old now almost, is called Being Dad, Father is a Picture of God's Grace. And that book covers sort of the importance of parents in the lives of their children and handing down the faith. Particularly, that book focuses on fathers and a lot of the data and experience around how important it is to have your dad be the driving force in the home for your faith and how much that affects kids here. This is the same kind of situation here when we talk about going to church and committed church attendance. There's huge knock-on effects to children. And we also see that the religious nuns that have been the real panic, it's growing to almost 30% of Americans here, and it looks like it'll probably go unchallenged up to the 50% mark. Most demographers are really confident that Christianity will always be the majority religion in the United States. It will always sort of barely outnumber this religious nuns, and no other world religion will tend to challenge it in the near future in the United States. But it is declining until the nuns and Christians sort of meet. And one of the big causes that we need to look at is actually Christians, self-professed Christians, who don't take their children to church or don't have a committed church life. And then it kind of surprises them, sneaks up on them, that their children end up religious nuns. They're generically spiritual. They probably believe there is a God there, but they're non-committal as to who that God is, what that God has done, if it matters. And so then I think it's important to look at why this is, and also deal with the fact that people, especially pastors, have been dealing with the issue of church attendance forever. I don't know how many of you guys have heard, but I've heard plenty of sermons which are basically at least have a hook in them complaining about the people who aren't in church that Sunday. Like usually, yeah, and it's a type of preaching to the choir situation. And so when talking about this issue, even for a talk like this, I find that that's one of the difficulties that I'm trying to overcome in having this conversation, is shouting at a bunch of people who already go to church, hey guys, there's a problem. A bunch of people don't go to church, because I probably don't need to convince people willing to come here on a Saturday morning that you need to go to church. You're pretty well convinced. I think for us, it's trying to be aware of the reasons people don't go to church, maybe ways in which we contribute to that problem that go beyond some of the normal ways we frame that or hear that, like, well, people at church are unfriendly, or, you know, they don't say hi to me, or I felt like I was isolated because everybody has their own pew already, and stuff like that. That's all very surface level stuff that you hear. But there are more real issues that I think Christians accidentally contribute to when it comes to this problem. So that's what we're going to look at. So next slide. So the implications of declining church attendance. The question we need to ask ourselves is, why do over half of Christians lack reasons to go to church? They're Christian. In these surveys, they're willing to say that, you know, their God is the triune God, that they're saved by Jesus Christ, that they have some sort of personal relationship or attachment to him. But why then would you not go to any church? Why couldn't you find even a single church that aligns with your values? Or if there is one that aligns with your values, why do you not attend? And another interesting part of this is the growing rise in what they refer to as online church attendance, which seems to me kind of like an oxymoron. I think you can watch certain things online, but this will be like Pew in its surveys actually refers to, say, watching church on a live stream, watching sermons, new or old or decades old, online, maybe even listening to a podcast like mine, which I am horrified by this idea. It would be marked as online church attendance. Online church attendance. So, and that's just up to the person to determine if that qualified for them as the equivalent of church attendance, right? So you're talking digital media, TV, and things like that. So in-person versus online worship is, I think, a very important aspect that we need to consider in this. Another is, did you attend church as a child? So raise your hand if you regularly attended church as a child. Let's just like survey the room here. Okay, that's like almost everybody. We had like one no hand, and then we had one 50-50, and then almost everybody else. So that would align pretty well with Pew's survey, which basically shows that people who grew up in households where church attendance was regular, so met that regular standard, and probably in the past, the regular standard would be a little higher than 6 times a year, but meets the regular standard. And then you go even one step further. Let's raise our hand. Raise your hand if faith was talked about or taught in the home in addition to church for you, like at home. Okay, yep. There are even more. So you combine those two things, regular church attendance with an obvious commitment to the faith in the household by the parents, and you exceed over 80% of those children will be regular church attending Christians into adulthood. So we can already see where one of the biggest holes in this whole situation rests, is essentially first in not taking your kids to church regularly, and then second, even if you take your kids to church regularly, how can you add additional success that the faith will stick in their lifetime into adulthood? Was the faith taught and spoken at home? Was it obvious to you that your parents weren't just passively going to church, but were committed members of this religion who knew something? I think what's interesting about that is my whole life, media, especially like TV and pop culture media, has told you the exact opposite of that. Basically said that if the parents are like highly religious, controlling parents, if your household culture was Christian, your children would rebel. They would experience the world out from their friends. They would listen to that bad music with swearing in it and the car ride home with somebody else, and they would get a taste of what it was like to be a free person who doesn't have Christian morals pushing down on them, and they'd run away from the faith. And so you better be careful about how hard you push this at home and what kind of morality. Man, was that just wrong. Yeah.
Well, it would be interesting to look at mainly Lutherans versus a lot of the more pietistic.
Glad you said that. So they have this data too. There's a lot of data. There was too much for me to like pull screenshots of every chart, but we will come to that because there is a separation in denominations, and I think that helps with the children. Okay, then the last sort of big one here that I noticed: non-religious spouse or partner. So marriage is like a very important part of this. Interestingly enough, this negatively affects Roman Catholics at like 300% the rate that it does Protestants. Mostly because Protestants, whether you're kind of Lutheran, Presbyterian, Baptist, or whatever, when they get married, they can kind of figure out how to get along, and one spouse will generally convert with little hesitation. It's actually extremely common. In fact, in Lutheranism, the most common way that somebody converts from another Christian denomination to Lutheranism today is marriage. And amongst Protestants, whoever is sort of the person most committed to their denomination that they grew up in will sort of just win out without, in most cases, without a lot of fighting. In mixed Catholic Protestant marriages, they end up basically just, in a lot of cases, like a third of cases, just not going to church anymore. It just is sort of unimportant. Catholics also marry outside of their religious system, so Protestants or non-religious, at a much higher rate than Protestants do, which is interesting when you consider that getting married is one of the ways that they actually receive grace, like that they can limit their time in purgatory or secure salvation, because marriage for them is one of the 7 sacraments. And if you're not a priest, it's the sort of the sacrament that you complete last before last rites. And so most of them are choosing to be in a marriage that is outside of their sacramental system as well. So there's something interesting there. But those are sort of the big 3. So let's talk first about in-person versus online worship. I think this is a huge problem after COVID, because most churches absolutely did not know how to navigate this issue, and they're not really at fault for that. People, I think it's really easy to blame people for doing the wrong thing during COVID in retrospect. We didn't have all of the information, the degree to which any particular thing that was said or done by the government, health officials, your local officials, hospitals, was true or not is really hard to decide. And there was a lot of fear, and so a lot of churches closed up shop to devastating effects, to then transfer completely to online worship, or online worship with maybe like drive-by communion or something like that. I think in worst case scenarios, like online sacraments and stuff like that were happening too. But that was happening. I can say from personal experience, I know that this was massively devastating in my community up in Big Bear. There's a small Lutheran church in Big Bear that we now attend. During that time, I was still a member at Prince of Peace, Anaheim, down here, and was driving my family off the mountain regularly for church. But that church decided to just close, except for every 3rd Sunday, do parking lot communion and then send out digital sermons. Their attendance went from like 75 people a Sunday down to 12 once they reopened. So, this is not uncommon. The smaller your church, the more devastating the effects of this. But a lot of people could not make the transition from, I don't have to get ready in the morning, I can just open the laptop, or I can listen to this at my leisure later in the week, to coming back to in-person worship. A lot of churches are still doing live streams of their service, and there's positive reasons for this, but I do think this is one of those areas where as Christians, it is probably hard to have as a congregation this conversation, because everybody will want input, and somebody will be negatively affected if you have an online stream, and somebody will be negatively affected if you don't. There's always that. But I do think it's one of those things post the sort of, we're all in church, the COVID thing is hopefully not going to happen again, where people are considering closing their churches over some sort of public emergency. It's something I think churches should consider stopping doing if they do it. I know the irony of this is that I'm on a Zoom call and a live stream or something right now. And the reason why is because when you look at Christians who say that they regularly attend church in person or online, that number jumps up to like 81% of Christians from that 51%. So about 30% of those Christians who do not attend church regularly say they attend church regularly online. Who is attending church online? Older people who it can be difficult to go to church. So we might say these are just people who would have been shut-ins or homebound Christians in the past. But I think actually what you're finding is it's not people who would be strictly homebound for health reasons, but that it is harder or inconvenient for them to get to church. They could use assistance or more time, and so the convenience of not getting ready to go will be there. If you talk to some people, it's actually even the embarrassment of going when you're sort of infirmed or having a hard time taking care of yourself. You feel like you're a burden to other people. And so it's not that you strictly can't go to church. It's that there's an emotional, overwhelming aspect of going to it. If you talk to a lot of pastors who visit homebound members, they will tell you that most of those homebound members are not homebound for physical reasons. like that they can't be picked up and driven to church and put there, but that they feel like that if somebody were to help them make it to church, that they would be an unnecessary burden on that congregation. It is probably true of some of your members here at Redeemer who are homebound, who for strict medical reasons don't need to be homebound, but will not ask for the help and will probably turn down help if offered in a lot of cases. And so it's sort of a difficult conversation. Online worship can be a blessing to those people who are homebound or who feel like they would be a burden otherwise, but it can also validate that really they don't need to go to church. I can just continue to do this. It also, for people sort of on the go, you can find out that listening to like radio sermons on KFUO or listening to telesermons and things like that, they'll just say it counts. Like, I'm too busy to go to church. I have other things going on in my life. If I can just listen to a sermon that encourages me, then I'm good. And a lot of that comes too from an issue that we'll talk about towards the end of this, which is the positive reasons to go to church. And one of those is not really encouragement in the way that that word is used today popularly in Christianity. We'll hear a lot of that. I really hope that this book encourages you, or I hope that this podcast encourages your faith, or that this sermon encourages you. It's a kind of a catch-all for the positive effects of any Christian preaching or teaching at all today. I think it's kind of a word that we should drop a little bit. It's not totally unbiblical, because we know that the gospel brings us comfort and steadfastness, and all the promises that it delivers are encouraging to us as we live in a sinful world. But that word has become a catch-all for any positive feelings I have after interacting with Christian theology and faith outside. And I think it's become sort of a way of saying, I don't need to go to church as long as I felt encouraged this week. That's the goal of going to church, is to feel encouraged in my faith. And if I feel encouraged in my faith, I can do that in many different ways. So that's one of them. Did you attend church as a child? So we'll come back to this one. This one is interesting because of the denominational breakdown of this. The more time that your parents and church leaders spent specifically educating you and talking to you, the higher likelihood you have of going to church as an adult. So if you really want to help solidify the future of your congregation, that its attendance stays healthy, that it's got active members who want to see it open, people committed to having the gospel proclaimed in your community, the kids that are in church on Sunday right now are what you got. That is the most important people in the pews every Sunday are the children. And what does that mean? Well, I don't think it means you need things like big evangelical churches do, like children's church. And this is kind of a hot topic that I also deal with a homeschool co-op that I help run in Big Bear. They meet at our congregation now, which is very nice. But what I run into is that 90% of those kids, they go to evangelical church, one of two evangelical non-denominational churches in the valley for the most part. And they are, we do a chapel service during this co-op, which is out of the Lutheran service book. It's just the morning prayer service that's in LSB. It's like page 278 or 298, I remember. It's like a one-page little service. We do the opening responsive prayers. We sing one hymn out of there, so then they get practice flipping through the hymnal as well, because it's really devastating to me that people don't know how to use hymnals anymore. So we practice flipping through the hymnal to get to our song. They sing one song, give a short message on a related topic, and then Luther's morning prayer, and we're out. And one of the things I noticed when I started this was, this is a non-drop-off homeschool co-op. We are not a daycare. We do not, parents have to be present from the time we go there to the time. We don't carry insurance. We're not a child care facility. This is a ministry that is a family ministry. Parents would just straight up disappear for this chapel. Just go out into the parking lot, go into the foyer, go into the fellowship area. And I noticed by like the second chapel, there were like 2 parents, and there's 27 to 35 kids there on a Wednesday. So, and each one of them has to have at least one, assuming there's some siblings, there's probably like 15 to 18 parents present, and you'd have 2 sitting in chapel. Why? They were so used to dropping their kids off at children's church or them leaving during anything that wasn't worship music that they thought this would be the same thing here. And so then I had sort of a long series of announcements and meetings with these parents that your children are watching you. If you drop them off at church or Sunday school or whatever it is, and you disappear then, they will realize that it's completely unimportant to come to chapel and that this is just an arbitrary requirement of going to school every other Wednesday, because these are homeschool kids who have no other consistent thing going on in their life. And so this is just what school is like. This is just what scheduling is like. You get dropped off at chapel. But for mom and dad, it's more important that I go talk about my week with other parents right now. And so that was like a little change that I didn't mandate that parents had to come to chapel, but did have a serious set of conversations with them about, you think your kids don't notice that you leave. They notice that you leave. So did you attend church as a child with your parents? I think is the kind of important thing here. And we actually see this when we look at the denominational breakdown, which Tom was correct at guessing here, which is when you look at the churches with the highest success rate of were you raised in XYZ faith, and did you stay in XYZ faith to adulthood? The top 3 are kind of telling. So the number 1 is Southern Baptists. Southern Baptists who do lack this children's church thing. They worship together. They have very, very exciting, lively worship, long preaching, big vocal preaching, kind of performance style preaching. But their families are all preached to and sort of yelled the law at together on Sunday mornings. Okay, they're told to go be good people, but all is one unit together. Number 2. I was so happy to see this, Lutherans. Now this is combined, all Lutheranism, so Missouri Synod, ELCA, Wells, but just generically, you added up, Lutherans were number 2, and it was like just over 50%. So it's not amazing, but it's like 57% will stay Lutheran. Then when you add like the rest who will stay Christian, if they were in a home committed to going to church and teaching the faith at home, you're over 80% stay Christian, which is great. And over 57% stay Lutheran, and that's number 2. I will say that should kind of wake us up to something. I don't know what it's like here on Sunday mornings, but if you've been going to church your whole life, there's a lot fewer, at least in my experience, and I travel a lot and speak at a lot of churches, there's a lot fewer kids around, aren't there, in the pews? Like it really is like, and there's a lot fewer people my age around, I would say, especially. Like there's a huge lack of, let's say, 25 to 40-year-olds sitting in the pews, and you kind of look around and you go, where are they? How could this statistic be right? Wouldn't those people who this survey is about be about 25 to 40 right now? We didn't have enough kids is what that tells us. Like Lutherans we did a good job keeping kids in the faith when we brought them to church, catechized them, but we didn't have enough kids. So if we want to fix this in the future, the thing we really have to do is those 25 to 40-year-olds that you have now, you got to put a lot of pressure on them to have some more kids. They got 1 kid hanging around. You got to bug them about having that 2nd, that 3rd, or that 4th. Warren here has recently stepped up. He's had his 3rd. So that's great. I'm working on number 5 here. So number 5 is due in like three weeks for me. So I'm working. I am trying to save Lutheranism 1 kid at a time. It probably won't work, but it's fine. So, but that's actually a big part of it. Christianity, specifically Protestant Christianity, very much fell into the social values of the West as a whole and the declining fertility rates that had to do with a lot of different factors, the economic factors and working factors in the United States. Lutheranism really bought wholesale the second wave feminist movement to independent work outside of the home for both mom and dad, and then the limiting factors that had on how many children people are willing to have. If both parents are working outside of the home 40 plus hours a week, it's really difficult to desire to have more than 2 kids, because you probably already feel like you're struggling to split the attention that you feel like you should be giving those kids during the week. And there was very little pushback on that, and very little pushback on things like chemical birth control within the Lutheran Church as well, and asking questions about the effects of that, or how does that actually work? Is it non-abortive at times when they say it is, and things like that. Very little pushback on that, and that's across Protestantism, including Lutheranism, and the effects of that have basically been the decline to fertility rates that match that of the secular West, now under 2 children per woman. And so it's like 1.9, 1.8, depending on, and it's only getting worse every year. And so there's some devastating effects there. And if the number one way that your church stays at its numbers or keeps people in the faith is by raising children in the faith, and you just kind of shut off the faucet on having children, you have a serious problem. I think this is something that needs to be talked about way more in churches. But it is a difficult conversation because we've consigned that this is all personal preference. Because it's not really strictly sin to say have 1 kid, right? And so we don't want to sit there and tell people like, well, you really should have more kids for Jesus or something like this, right? And
you're focusing on Genesis, be fruitful and multiply.
yeah, basically, I think the way that you can do this without pressuring people into some sort of works righteousness by having as many kids as possible, which we've experienced, which is like the quiverful movement. I don't know if you guys have ever heard this. It was, yeah, right? The quiverful movement is a good example of this, is sort of the positive aspects to this, asking questions about should financial security be the most important thing you talk about to your teenagers who are entering adulthood? I think right now in the West and in the church, that was the most important thing communicated to children. Financial stability, I don't want to be paying your bills, is what parents essentially communicated. It also turns out that kids basically do what you tell them to do. The whole rebel thing is kind of a misnomer. Yes, there's always some rebels who do the opposite of what their parents say, but on the whole, people do what they tell them to do. So college attendance is a great example of this. Most people go to college because they felt like it was communicated that they should go to college by their parents, that they would have better outcomes by their parents. Whether their parents said, you are going to college or not, the communication and the regular communication in their life was, you should go to college. Down the list, really far, of things they felt like their parents communicated them is, I want you to have children. That was like, and what we have found in many surveys, my dad's covered some of this in his next book called Being Family that's coming out in May, is that people assumed this one. It just is assumed. Like, you will get married, you will have kids. That's just, everybody does it. The whole world's been doing it forever, so obviously that will happen. So I'll tell you everything else. I will tell you everything else I want from you. I'll tell you that I want you to get educated. I'll tell you that I want you to have a good job. I'll tell you that your personal happiness is important to me. All that kind of stuff. And then this one got just knocked down the list. And so people deprioritized it. And then it got later and later in life to the point where we're like, age of average first child is up by a decade from the 90s. So it was 22 years old. It's now 32 years old. And the way we treat people in those age brackets is extremely different too. We treat 22-year-olds now who, when I was born 30 years ago, would have been adults. We treat them like children. They are talked to like children. They are told to keep extending their life like a child. Make sure you travel first. Make sure you spend all the money you could responsibly spend in this period of time. Make sure you spend the next decade saving for a house. You wouldn't want to have kids before you could buy a house, right? All this kind of stuff happens. And it just puts it in the back of their mind, and then the number of children that they're willing to have goes down. Until they're 17, this is kind of interesting too. This is a different set of surveys. Until they're 17, the average girl in the United States in her teenage years, from the age of 13 to like 18, desires more than 3 children. If you ask them how many children you have, they will mostly say 3 or 4. 3 or 4. 18 to 25-year-olds, that goes down to like 1 in that short span of college for girls. You put them on birth control their entire high school years, you change their hormonal structure, you send them to college, and after those 8 years, that desire goes down to like 0 to 1, until they're like 35 again. And then it shoots straight back up to where they were in high school. And almost everybody answers that question, 3. I wanted 3. And then they'll say, how many did you have? 2. And so then the majority of people end up below their desired fertility rate as well. But it's this huge rubber band in those years. And so it's like one sort of like the ideas of a girl who has no idea what that all entails. And then it seems like hard work. Life's too hard in the middle when I'm working and building something. And then it goes to regret when it's late. And so that's kind of the rubber band we're on. And I think the last thing I will say about that is I think the church, Christians, should be careful about building our sort of ethics and values around family formation and childhood in complete alignment with that of the Western world. That they're obviously just not contradictory at all. When God has given us family as the first blessing of creation, be fruitful and multiply was the first blessing that he gives Adam and Eve, is to have children. And we say there's obviously no contradiction. It's just pure free will and desire, whether you have 0 or whether you have a dozen. It's completely all irrelevant. It's just personal thing. So I think we should probably audit that a little bit.
So when you say the Western world, I mean, the Eastern world has even worse problems.
Yeah, decline. Now, the reason I say Western is because most of the West has a Christian background, right? So at least then basically we could say that we are declining from the same religious and ideological and philosophical background position. The East was also declining at a different way. It's not like off a cliff. Like India is now down to 2, when even 20 years ago it was like 6.5 children per woman, and they're now like hovering around 2.3. So that's even greater decline. And you see that in other parts of the Eastern world or the non-developed world as well. But I think the reason to focus on the West for us is our background, our demographic, our history comes from the West for the most part here in the United States. And Christianity's influence on the culture in the West, and then its loss of that influence on the culture in the West. And then sort of I think the flip-flop that we're seeing now, which is like the secular aftermath of the post-Christian-y West now bleeding into the church. And I think the reason for that is because the church built the post-Christian West, like a Christian West built the post-Christian West, which is really interesting. And I think that's why you see things like the language of love being the prime ethic of our age. It's a disordered love. It's a love towards incorrect things often, but even things like care for the environment. Like environmentalism is at times out of control, but it gets its language and its motive from Christianity, from the Christian tradition of the West, of caring for the creation, of loving our neighbor as ourselves, and things like that, and reordering where those loves are placed in society. And so I think it's easy to kind of say, like, yeah, of course it has back pressure back onto Christianity when that language connects as well. And then the non-religious spouse or partner is the last one on this. I think this one's just kind of obvious. You know, if we do not speak the importance of marrying somebody of like-minded values, tradition, and faith, you're going to see your values eroded in that next generation. The more people marry non-Christians, you know, sometimes this is viewed as like missionary outreach the other way, evangelism by marriage, and sometimes it works out that way. It really depends on who's sort of got the stronger convictions. And I would say today the one that's hard is the religious nun, because that person seems like kind of easygoing, easy to get along with, non-confrontational about religion. That tends to win because it's sort of just an ethos of everybody gets along, and if this marriage is going to work, everybody just got to get along. So that is something to consider. Again, people mostly do what they tell you to, so I think this is encouragement to just tell young people, tell young adults that your expectation or your desire would be that they marry a Christian. That's not that hard. Now, if they don't, you know, I've had members of my family not. It can work out. I'm not saying it's like all doom. I'm saying as a general good, as a general desire, in most cases, what would we hope for? This is kind of the best case scenario when it comes to the longevity of our beliefs, the proclamation of our beliefs, and spreading even out to the entire world. And sometimes this is pit against evangelism. So you'll hear this debate between evangelism by birth and then like true evangelism. If you have kids, it doesn't really count as evangelism because you didn't go out and save the lost, and the goal of Christianity is to go save the lost. The problem is you're actually more effective at going and saving the lost when you have people, resources to send out into the lost world. As you lose resources to send people out into the lost world, you sort of lose that ability to do evangelism as well. This is the same stats. Children from regular worship homes, 23% more likely to remain Christian. So if you didn't regularly worship, it turns out it's not like immediate doom. You won't be a Christian, but you will probably be in this category of Christian but non-church attending. If you grew up in a Christian but non-church attending, you're more likely to be that than a nun, but that number keeps coming up. And then they're over twice as likely to avoid becoming a religious nun altogether. So that's very important. So let's go to the positive case here. That's all the doom and gloom, and is trying to front load it. But the question that we have to ask about church attendance, is it important to go to church? Why is it important to church? Is not just all this demographic stuff. It's not just like our churches will be bigger. There will be more resources around. There'll be more Christians, and won't that be great? We actually need to look at the theological sort of implications of this. What does a Christian church and theology actually teach about the church, going to church? What's the point? What's the benefit? Why do we desire this outcome in the first place? Why would we be unhappy that 51% of Christians don't go to church? At least they still say they're Christian. Why is this a problem? So we'll just go to the scripture for this. The church comes from a Greek word, ekklesia, and it most commonly occurs to describe a called out assembly of believers in Christ who gather together. The church, this word, is sort of ordained and used in the New Testament scriptures first by Jesus speaking to his disciples. You might know where he looks at Peter, and when Peter makes a confession saying, who do you say that I am? He says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And he looks at Peter and says, on this rock I will build my church. It's in Matthew. That's the first time this word is used. I will build this church. What is he building? He's building the gathering together of those who have this confession, that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. This is what the church is. It is being brought together for that. What else do we know about the church for the New Testament? Where is this word used? Well, it's specifically and most frequently associated with a location, specific locations. Where can you find it? The book of Acts. The book of Acts is like every 5 sentences uses the word church. It's the most frequent place that the word church is being used, and it's in reference to groups of people across the world, across this spreading of the gospel. Every time the gospel is preached somewhere or the apostles return from somewhere, the result has been the establishment and the gathering of a church in that area. So every time somebody hears the gospel, every time somebody is baptized, the result is either the formation of the church or the joining of a church. It is never just sort of like wandering in the desert or going home just to their home and being like, man, I'm so glad I got this good news. It is always, the terminus is always with another group of Christians. The other location throughout the New Testament that we hear this is the beginning of most of our epistles. What is the actual name of Romans or Galatians or Ephesians? The letter to, right? The epistle to the church in Rome, right? So we shorthand these. This is just Romans. The same thing when it comes to most of the epistles. Yeah, Steve.
Yeah, I started doing that with, we have people that are not very familiar with the Bible,
Mm-hmm.
the church that I go to in the evenings, and I started doing, Paul's letter to the Romans, so that they know it's a letter, they know it was to particular people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think in the context of this, I think it's even helpful to say the church in, right? Because you can kind of even say, well, like if it's to the Romans, it's contextual for people living in Rome. Well, the letter is not just generically sent and like spread across houses in Rome, being like, this really matches your context. Sure, go for it. Yeah, do it. Same with Galatia. and Ephesus. These are locations. It is a letter to the church, and that church there is not just like the spiritual church. It is to the saints gathered together in regular worship in those locations. So that's what we know about this word. And I guess the important distinction for me here is the difference between an internal and an external call to faith. Has anybody here heard that distinction before? Not to faith, but the distinction between an internal and an external call? Yeah, so we most frequently use this phrasing when we talk about our pastors, okay, or church workers. So we'll say that a church worker or a pastor first has maybe an internal call to the ministry. That means a feeling or the idea, a desire to go into full-time public ministry. It's sort of internal to them, it's in their thoughts and feelings. Maybe they've discussed it with family and friends, and we would call that the internal call. That does not make you a pastor or a church worker, right? Just the desire to do it, at least not in our tradition. Sometimes in other traditions, that means you'll just go start a church or something like that. But in our tradition, that does not do it. So then how is that finalized? How does that person become then a full-time church worker or called into ministry? They receive what we call an external call. That is, members of a congregation call them into the ministry, right? Specific ministry for them in their location. They can do that. Sometimes there's ones that are a little less specific, maybe some missionaries abroad or something like that. But again, an external body of people call them and say, this is where we are placing you. And that congregation is then using the authority of the church given to them by the gospel to establish that person for that ministry, an external call. I think it's useful to adopt this language when it comes to the personal realm of faith as well. That we have an internal call or personal call from the gospel to faith. That you have a personal confession of faith, that I believe in Jesus Christ, right? That you have a feeling, that an overwhelmed feeling of salvation or whatever it may be, the comfort of the gospel. But that is not God's final desire for you when it comes to the faith. It is not just the internal call, the personal belief in the back of your head, or even the ability to say out loud that I believe in Jesus Christ, but is finalized by an external call. That is the church, the other Christians in the world, calling you into communion with them. And we experience the external call most visibly in baptism. This is where this happens, where the external word is not just proclaimed out of your lips, but placed on you in water in the word. The name of God is placed on you. And baptism is something you can't do yourself. It is something that the church must do to you and join you to them. And so the external-internal distinction here. And so I think it's important to emphasize that the Christian faith is external. It is necessarily external. It is necessarily a gathering of believers. That when you are baptized, it is intended that you are now eternally joined to these people, not just in your thoughts and your hopes, but physically gathered together with them. And that the church has an obligation to keep those physically gathered together. The same is true about why, yes, Steve?
Yeah, I was just going to say the gospel comes with family and place.
Yeah.
Get both of those.
Yeah, it has
You didn't have
location.
one. If you're disenfranchised because you believe the gospel, which happened to several of my friends, where their families completely rejected them. In fact, some of it was cultural, where the family was Muslim. So, what happens now? How do I live? In that culture, the family is much more prominent than individualism.
Right.
So it's a very different dynamic, and it's much more pronounced. These people lose everything, their culture, their family, and so now they get a whole new one because God knows they need that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you receive a family. You're joined into the family of God by this external call. And so I think, again, some of this for me is just trying to use some language regularly that sticks with people. I'll go back to what I said earlier, which is people kind of do what you tell them to do, whether they know it or not, or what you expect them to do. If the way we talk about church does not include the gathering together, or the way we talk about the Christian faith is completely isolated from the fact that the faith has a terminus and a physical location for us. And it doesn't just have to be on Sunday mornings, but that it has a physical location for us, this slips away. And we can just see this in Christian culture today, that the more and more personal the faith has become, this corporate necessity of faith has disappeared. For a church like ours, and for those who are well catechized, this can be kind of obvious, which is to say, we believe that like the sacraments are not just signs. Right? They're not just representations, they're not just good feelings or vibes or carry on, but that they actually deliver the power of God to us. That when you receive the Lord's Supper, you receive the body and blood of Christ for the forgiveness of your sins, and that it actually does something to you. So to us, this is really can be kind of obvious, but again, the language of the necessity of this gathering can slip away. Sometimes in just disappointment, like I said, the example of like, you know, pastor ragging on people who are missing church for soccer practice or something like that, which is very frustrating and dumb, and it's sort of ridiculous that sports has taken such a place in this. But part of that is the language of necessity when it comes to this. If people are really willing to sign up their kids for Sunday sports versus come to church, the problem isn't really the fun or that they're choosing to do that on Sunday morning. It's that that church was already non-essential before they even made that decision. If they could even weigh those, if they could go, soccer, church, it was already a lost battle, because there's something essential about church that's not being communicated. It is an option. It was an option before soccer practice started by then. So this is a part of our catechesis, is to say that what is done here is the delivering of God's power every Sunday. And so then we're trying to kind of communicate something as well, which is when you're out in the world and you're a Christian, you're not actually called to go be searching for God's love, searching for God's word, searching for God out in the world, whether that's on a hike in nature or on the radio on your car or whatever it is, because God has already promised to be in a particular place at a particular time for you. So if your options are, I'm going to go find God, or I'm going to go try to experience God this week somewhere, listen to him, or your option is, I can go where God has promised that he is already located, where he's already delivering certain things to me, and you actually believe you should go receive from God or experience those gifts from God. Which one do you think is actually worth pursuing? The random search for God where you might find him this week or you might not find him this week or it might communicate to you, or the one where he's promised to be? I would say the one where he's said he's promised to be is the way to go. So again, this is language that I think it's in our confessions. It's in our expression of the faith naturally. But it's something that we have to return to in the way that we talk regularly, which is to say that church is not comprised of attendance. It's not doing something for God. God does not need your church attendance. You need what he has there. And you, again, when it comes to this success of children coming to church and the faith, this is one of those communications. Are you going there because you have a moral obligation to do this on Sunday, or else you won't know how to be a good person during the week? Or is this earning something before God that happens a lot in a lot of Christian traditions? Or is this, we go to church because God has promised to come to us and give us his gifts there?
I think our generation, because before all this technology, we were all communication, and that kept us in church. Now technology, everybody online, there is no communication. So we need to teach parents to pray with their children and to work with their children everywhere. I was single mom taking care of my mom more than 30, but I was Sunday school teacher, I was summer camp counselor, always involved parents with the children, and it's a lot of work, but we need to teach everybody to pray together, not online, together.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of work, and I was very busy, but I still did it. And
Yeah. No, it is a lot of work, and I think that's also why I think, again, in the post-COVID thing, auditing our digital services that our church offers actually appropriate, considering ending live streams for instead sending direct video to the homebound, for instance, who require it, and things like that. I think that would be negatively received in most churches today that have invested in doing this kind of thing, but I do think it's something everybody should consider. Your live stream on Facebook or YouTube is not a successful outreach strategy for getting new members at your church. It just isn't. And so I think that's that. I also think there's a responsibility on the part of people like us at 1517 who are digital media for the church to regularly be communicating to those listeners, to those viewers, that the terminus for what they're hearing is the local congregation. It's not subscription to our YouTube channel or our podcast or whatever it is.
I think there is benefit in someone maybe who has moved to the community is searching for churches. How do they search for churches? They look up their websites, they go online.
Yeah.
Right? And if they were able to see a service that was live streamed, that they say, hey, I'd like to be there. You don't think that is an effective way of advertising your church?
I think it's about as effective as communicating on the church what kind of services you have through pictures and through descriptions of your service, and that you have to pick an angle as well. In this age, everybody's about distinctions. So sort of being like the church for everybody is not the most successful strategy. So like having a contemporary service and a traditional service and a we're family friendly and we have the, is like trying to appeal to everybody is appealing to nobody. Trying to appeal to your base is in today's marketing term. Now that might be the right thing for your congregation. You might have all those things because you have a congregation that constitutes those groups already. You might have a late contemporary service and an early traditional service because your congregation has constituted those two groups for 30 years or something like that. And sometimes you get like a young pastor come in and just start like nuking things that it doesn't like. And sometimes that's worth it, sometimes that's not. Other times, if it's a marketing issue, I would say, yeah, you should actually pick a lane. If you're trying to, in the digital marketing world, if you're like, we're trying to be a distinctive for people looking for something in this community, pick one. And go for it, and just go full for it is the kind of thing. And I think you can communicate that with, like apart from a live stream, for instance, for that. I think most churches will justify a live stream, and again, the homebound, those members who can't make it, plus marketing strategy. If we're on YouTube, it's better than not being on YouTube, right? Maybe. I mean, most of these churches are getting like 40 views, 30 views on a YouTube video.
Well, I mean, I think, though, that you have to take a close look at your membership, right?
Yeah.
Who is attending, who isn't? Is your live stream attendance on the time that you're broadcasting it? Do you have 50 people and they're not here in the church
Yeah.
service?
So I'll give you an example of, I'm not going to name it, but there's a church closest to me. You might be able to guess the closest Lutheran church to mine besides the other one. When I was talking to their previous pastor, he would talk about that they had 300 people on a Sunday. And I was like thinking about their building. And I was like, how do you have 300 people in that? You don't have 300 people in that building. On 200, 175 were counted Facebook views, like from a live stream. So it's like, and that's now being reported as church attendance from that. So that it,
I
and
would not argue that that's
yeah.
church attendance. The other reason, though, that I think is valid is that you have your regular members who go on vacation.
Sure.
And they may not have a good alternative, or no alternative,
Yeah.
where they're at, right? And so then they want to,
I agree. I also, it's not the same. I would say if you can't join a regular congregation on a Sunday on vacation for whatever reason, it's also not, and you're like that type of person. You're on vacation and you're maybe looking for a church to go to and you end up in a community where there isn't a good option for you on Sunday. I don't think it's that devastating to your faith to miss that Sunday, if that's the way it plays out, if that makes sense. You're talking about somebody who's already a committed believer. Yeah. Correct. It's not normal. And in fact, I wouldn't call it worship. It might be listening to the sermon, but it's not presence in the divine service. It's not active participation in receiving an absolution from your pastor or receiving the body and blood of Christ. It may be edifying to listen to a good sermon, but there's lots of ways to do that, sans my church live streaming its services on Sunday, if that makes sense. And from an SEO perspective too, I think the Lutheran churches really should do a better job optimizing search engine optimization. In fact, there's a way to get your church at the top of the listings, if you do it correctly, for just your area when people search church, not just Lutheran church and stuff. And I do think more churches should invest in being at the top of those listings, having high quality web pages that, again, communicate that identity that you're selling. If the thing you're selling is confessional Lutheranism, and that's your angle, that should be at the top of everything on every page of your website and things like that, so it's really communicated to people. If it's something else, it's something else. But those are the kinds of things I think are the most effective when it comes to that. Yeah, so let's just all wrap up. I started late, but as long as you guys are good, I'm just going to start wrapping up. Some other things to consider here. There is no church. So as I said, we went to the definition of church. It's that gathering of all believers together in specific locations. Something that I think we also have to emphasize is there is no church. There is no church apart from our gathering, apart from doing this gathering. And one of the things that you find with the people who are non-regularly attending, like your Creasters, Christmas, Easter attenders, or whatever, there's an assumption there that there will always be a church for me to go to. So they're essentially exporting the job of keeping these institutions open that they do expect to gather in sometimes or to be there for them when they need it on everybody else. And I think that's a very important thing, even for us who might be regular attenders, when there's things necessary to like keeping the building open, certain volunteer things at church that aren't the explicit responsibility of your pastor. I would say even things like showing up on time to church and not 20 minutes late and things like that are an example of the assumption that I'll be there. If everybody showed up to church 10 minutes late, would there be church? Kind of thing. Do you show up late occasionally? Okay, it's fine. Something happened, freeway, whatever. But this is part of that commitment. That if we have the mindset that if I don't show up, the church doesn't exist, that's a stronger thing. This has become very real for me at a church of what has fluctuated from when I started going there to in the past and now back down, like 12 to 40 people down to like 25. If I don't show up, this place does not exist on Sunday morning. It disappears. And if that becomes kind of real for everybody, if that's real for 100% of your congregation when they wake up in the morning, if I don't show up, church doesn't exist for everybody else either. Not just for me, but for other people. That is true. If we all elect to not show up, it doesn't exist for anybody anymore. And so I think that's one. But then the positive end that we've talked about, which is that this is the location where God's promises are specifically delivered to you. You can, of course, have your sins forgiven by other Christians in your life. Go confess your sins to your spouse. Come to private confession in the middle of the week with your pastor, or meet with somebody, have the consolation of the brethren, and things like that. But this is that guaranteed rest on Sunday mornings. And does it have to be Sunday morning? No, it doesn't have to be Sunday morning. Are there good historical, traditional reasons that it's on Sunday mornings? Absolutely. But this is that service, when your church schedules divine service, is that place where God has promised to come and serve you with the proclamation of the word, with the administration of his sacraments. And that is essentially our message to people, is that when we are able to evangelize in our lives, to share the gospel at home with our children, at home with a spouse, in the workplace, just out in the world, that terminus would be, it doesn't have to just be this one time. This forgiveness of sins that you've experienced doesn't have to just be right now. It can be all the time. And so join the family with me is essentially the message. Come with me to church. I'd like to come with you to church, those kinds of things. Join them even, maybe if it goes. And that's where I think the final thing is that faith begins and its terminus is outside of ourselves. Faith does not begin in quiet contemplation inside the mind and the heart, but from the external word of preaching and the external application of water and the word in baptism. That is where faith begins. In order for it to be external, it comes from other people. Those other people are gathered together. You don't have to go stand on the street corner, right, and wave your hand and say, is there a Christian out there who could baptize me? Is there a Christian out there who could, this is what the church is. It's that street sign, that location that's permanently there to deliver that outside of us word to one another. And so, again, it's important to know that your faith is not just personal. It is not this, do you have a personal relationship with Jesus? That is not the end point of the faith. That's the end point of the faith for most of the churches in Southern California. That's the most important question that they'll ask you on your deathbed. I've even heard this recently. How's your walk with Jesus? How's your personal walk with Jesus. I don't want to know how that personal walk is with Jesus. I want to know how this extranos, this outside work from Jesus to me is. And instead of me figuring out how that feels, I need you to tell me what my relationship with Jesus is. That's the job of our pastors. That's the job that we have with one another, is to tell us what our relationship with Jesus is. And that's what the law and the gospel are, is to tell us that we are a sinner and then to tell us that we are forgiven. The church is that extra body, that's outside body, who tells us what our relationship with Jesus is. It's not our job to figure it out. And again, so this is like the realm of language audit when we're talking to people. It is not great. Like you can't concede to like, well, my kids don't go to church anymore, but at least they have a relationship with Jesus. You'll hear that. Or at least, they pray at Thanksgiving and they say they believe in God. That is not a good at least. That is not a good at least. The terminus is extranos, is outside of themselves. I would say at least they have you in their life, hopefully, to proclaim to them who they are in Christ if they're not going to church. That's the goal. If you have members of your family, children, friends, brothers, sisters, spouses, otherwise that you're in their life, you're their one shot when you interact with them at this extranos faith of proclaiming from outside of them, not asking them how they're doing with Jesus or what they believe anymore, but telling them that Jesus Christ has died and risen for them for the forgiveness of their sins. Don't be afraid to be a proclaimer extranos to other people. That impact, I think, has sort of really high expectations and effects for people then coming to church. If they are getting this extranos proclamation from you, that desire, we would hope that desire grows to then continue to get that proclamation from outside of themselves. And so that's where we can go. That's about it. The challenge here is, what do you do about all this? You can't fix this overnight. None of us are just like going to go out and fix that 51% of Christians are. But there are little things that I think each of us can contribute to, depending on your vocations and where you are in life right now. If you're a parent with children in the home right now, the most important thing you can do is go back to those opening slides I had and see that you are the school in the household of faith. It is the more you teach, proclaim, and speak about the faith in the home, the more this challenge sort of disappears. If you're in a different stage of life, if you're like on a church committee or decision making, you have an obligation to look at things and services that your church does and audit them. Are we encouraging people to stay at home? Is our visitation of the homebound adequate? Should I be offering to try to drive some of these people to church on Sunday morning and things like that? Can we increase the lives of the saints? Is there some way that I contribute to that? And this is a vocational issue. This is sort of personal. And the big one that I think all of us share is trying to adopt the appropriate language when it comes to the church and attendance. Not just browbeating people into going to church. There's a fine balance here. As I said, people will mostly do what you tell them to do. So we probably should adopt the language of telling people that we expect them to go to church more, especially young people in our lives, because they will mostly just do what they expect you out of them. But at the same time, making sure that our language is about that promise that God has placed in the church, that He does in the church, that this is that is not the exclusive location, that's the only place you can ever hear from God, but it is the promised place that you can hear from God. You don't have to look into your own heart. You don't have to listen in a quiet place. You don't have to find the right radio channel. It's just there all the time for you. And the more that we can use that appropriate language, I think the more that this problem declines in our lifetime, improves a little bit. So yeah, that's what I have on that.
Question. A lot of this obviously is focused on why we need the church, why you need the church.
Sure.
And why you can't get the sacraments by watching online or
Sure.
staying at home. Your other part, why the church needs you, how are you summarizing that part?
Well, I would say, to go back to that section where I was saying, the church disappears if you do not go to church. The sacraments are for the gathered together. A pastor can't just do the sacraments on his own, right? So we're not Roman Catholics having private masses in here just to sacrifice for the whole world. It is for for instance, the body and blood of Christ is to be both consecrated and received for the presence of Christ's body and blood for the forgiveness of your sins. Apart from the gathering of believers, there isn't that. Your church does need you. Also, when it comes to this question of like who is in the church, so in the United States, for every one person who converts to Christianity, 6 people leave the faith. Okay? So when we think of that in terms of mission and evangelism, so in the Missouri Synod, there has been a long debate, my entire life, maybe longer, but at least my entire life in our churches, between being confessional and like church-oriented and missional. Huge, like these are two fights in the thing. I would say one of the things that this reveals to us, this like 1 in 6 stat, and then you look at this other stat, that is if kids are well attended to at their church, educated at their church and in the home, that they have a 80% chance of staying in the Christian faith. Your biggest evangelism opportunity, and one of the ways your church needs you, is the way you deal with children. And that, I think, really blows up one of these debates and freakouts that's happened about this idea of, you can't do evangelism by having kids or by baptizing children. Evangelism by baptism versus evangelism out in the world, that doesn't count, kind of thing. Of course it counts. Literally 1 in 6, only one person comes to faith for 6 who leaves. You need to keep the 6 children in the faith, or else your evangelism is saving one. It's like going and finding one lost sheep for losing the 100. Christ does it, but he's not asking you to go lose your entire congregation over one person that you may or may not convert, right? This is that parable is about Christ on the cross. It's not about the way we should run our congregations and the way those things are. So I think that is another way in which your church needs you. It needs families. It needs people committed to coming. It needs children and young adults seeing people throughout the entire spectrum of their life being members in the church. I actually think that's one of the reasons, too, when I was talking about like the homebound, and that a lot of homebound are not actually medically homebound, but a lot of it is an emotional thing. We need to see people struggling in church. You need to see people who are not well, who are dying in the faith in your congregation as well, instead of just being okay with that they're dying at home instead. This is a cradle to grave experience, the Christian faith, and we shouldn't be hiding the babies. We shouldn't be putting them in children's church, and we shouldn't be hiding those who are dying either. We shouldn't just let them die at home or in the nursing home. They should be dying in front of us. And I think that's a big sort of part of why the church needs you, because how do we make that happen? By having relationships with these people. It is hard when it is just a pastor doing those things. Like, how many rides can he offer to church on Sunday morning and things like that? Now, again, like I said, 90% of people will turn you down. This is the experience of most pastors who go to the homebound and say, well, would you like somebody to bring you to church? No. Most people will turn you down. But the church does need you in those efforts when you notice that people sort of disappear from the life of the church, too. And that is because this is the gathering of believers. And so when the believers stop gathering, there's no church. And that happens one at a time, which is why this 51% number is alarming. And so the things that we can do unfortunately, the thing you can do for the future is something not all of us can affect, like in a direct way, because what we find is that the statistics really are around the children. That's why the religious nuns are increasing as well. That's a generational problem that it's hard to put back in the bottle. I've been working on an organization that was doing a lot of Gen Z outreach, so they're like 17 to just younger than me, like 27, 28 years old, and trying to get them back into church. You don't want to give up on any of this, but that is in some ways like way more difficult than saying, how do we look even younger? Like, how do we look at like the 12-year-olds now and stop that from happening? That's an easier question because we actually know the answer. The answer is we don't know the answer always when it comes to personally getting people back into church. That is, there's not a ton of data on that. It's very individual. It's once their time is gone for a decade, their time is gone. You'll find this. So, for instance, somebody stops going to church in their 20s when they're 18 because they go to college and they just don't go regularly. Maybe they go a little bit here. And they get used to that for 5, 10 years. How are you going to get them back? They're just used to it. Sunday is now a useful day to them. I have an example of a friend I have in Big Bear that I mountain bike with. He's a great guy, 2 kids. He's like 10 years older than me. We were on a ride one day. He's talking about He went to church his entire life. Every single Sunday. His dad was an elder in his church. They were Methodists. He said that even throughout high school, their church had a program where an elder had breakfast with you every Wednesday just to see how you were doing, to keep in touch. So he's not only going to breakfast with an elder from his church every Wednesday, he's also going to church every Sunday. He hasn't been to church since he was 19. He hasn't been to church since he was 19, and his children will likely never see the door of a church. Even though I talk to him all the time, he's like, man, it would be great to go to church again. I have such fond memories of it. You know, invite. Sunday's gone for him. Every time I talk to him, it's like, well, we're doing this on Sunday. Oh, we're doing this on. He's now got 20, he's 40, so he's now got 20 years of being used to having Sunday as free. That's a harder issue to deal with. It's not one that we should give up on. Like, I should keep preaching to him. I should keep pushing, especially for the sake of his children, because he.
It seemed like everything was right. Everything was done right up until he was 19.
Right, and there's always.
He went away.
And then he went away. And then he married somebody in a different faith. And then, you stack the things. It's why it's not a guaranteed success. Even then, it was like 80%, right? So he's in this 20% of people who grew up in a committed situation who left for one reason or another. He would, and this is what's interesting, this is a person who would identify as a Christian. If you ask him, are you a Christian? He's going to say yes. But his children don't even know what the word God is. They've not prayed over one meal in their entire life. They are going to be religious nuns. They're not going to be atheists. They're going to just be religious nuns. Does that see, we're like, so when we see this number increasing, and we think of people just like a little bit older than him too, in their 50s, who this is the same kind of thing, their children, their Gen Z children, are the religious nuns. It's the person who was a Christian, who calls themselves a Christian, but has 20, 30 years of no church attendance. So it's that 51% who are the parents of the religious nuns, essentially. Again, it's not something we can fix overnight, but I do think it's a problem that you look at what happened and you have to do like double down, triple down investment in the people who are 0 to 15 years old right now. Like that's probably the most important demographic like I said, I think those are the most important people you are preaching to on Sunday mornings, teaching on Sunday mornings. Because once you've stayed in the faith past a certain age and you've stayed as a regular church attender, in all likelihood you will stay that through the vast majority of your life. And so you make it basically past 25 as a church attender and you are probably locked in. The other thing with that, too, is related to kids, which is, why did he have a 20-year period where it didn't even occur to him to go to church? Well, he had his children at 38 years old. So he had from 18 to 38, period.
Should I get my kid baptized or not?
Yeah, nothing. Have kids younger, return to church earlier. And that was true, too. So it is not unique to millennials, Gen Z, to stop going to church during college. That has been true since like the 1960s. That the vast majority of people have a 3-4 year period where they don't go to church that often when they start their working life. It didn't even have to do with college attendance because those dates go back before the majority of people were going to college. It's just like you're getting your life started, you leave your parents' house, getting your life started as an adult, your church attendance in all likelihood declines somewhat. The second those people had kids, church attendance rises back up. You push having kids out a decade from where it was just 30 years ago, now they've had a whole decade of not going to church. So again, can you fix that problem in 30-year-olds now? No, they've already had the decade. Can you fix that problem for the 25-year-old who's not married yet? No, you're probably just going to sound like a jerk if you're just barking at them to fix this problem every other day. Who can you fix it with? 8-year-olds, 12-year-olds, maybe 15-year-olds now. And just being like, oop, wasn't using the right words. Well, it's like not communicating this expectation directly enough. The expectation, this should be more important than financial security. This should be more important than I want you to have a job where you're happy. I actually would rather you have a job where you're miserable and be married and have 2 kids. Personally, I'd rather you work yourself ragged than like be wealthy, buy your first house by 30, and not have kids or a spouse.
And how do you get kids after they've been confirmed say, well, I don't have to go to
that they don't have to go anymore. Parents, that's that other demographic of the parents who are not committed, right? The parents who think this is like, I've done my job. They're a Christian now. We're good. Yeah, that's a parent issue for sure. And that one is, I mean, maybe some of the sharing of these statistics, you have to think to their parents, it's at least somewhat important that they identify as a Christian, or else why even go through the steps of the confirmation and the baptism? So for most of these people, there is something where they want their kid to personally identify as a Christian. Yeah.
I knew a whole crew of Lutheran kids. I went to a Lutheran grade school who looked at their confirmation certificate as their diploma. They had like one foot out the door.
Yeah.
And it was largely on the parents, because the parents would drop them off.
And I've experienced this. So I happen to know everybody who was in my confirmation class, mostly because it was like 5 of us. So it wasn't that many. And my brothers and the ones around us. We went to a small enough church. I happen to know that of all of those kids, only 3 of us still attend a Lutheran church. 2 of them are me and my brother. So, and then the other one was, she's a girl who her dad was like the switched between head elder and congregational president several times throughout my lifetime there, was committed, kept the church open in a lot of ways. Really, there's some attachment to how much it was spoken at their house too, and stuff like that. But it's not a guarantee. I think one of her siblings left the faith entirely, and that's just in one household. So of course it's not a guarantee. Or even there's like greater examples, like Sainted Jim Nessigan. 2 of his kids had left the faith at least temporarily, and he was this amazing preacher and teacher of the faith who was obviously committed to it. And that's not uncommon either. How many times have we seen like the PK who just like ditches everything? That's not uncommon either. So there's a lot of social factors here. What I'm saying is, again, not guarantees, but we just know from self-reporting data that if you spoke the faith at home multiple times a week, if you prayed and it seemed important to you, and you brought your kids to church, 80% chance that they came to church. So that as an adult, that they're still regularly attending church as an adult. Do we all know people who had that experience and are not regularly attending church? Yes, we probably all know somebody in those 20%. And of course, there's all sorts of reasons for those. But I would say the best bet is to just lean with that.
I'm curious whether the Pew surveys or Barna or anybody
Yeah.
that you know about delve a little deeper into these people who say that they're Christian but are not practicing anything. What do they associate with Christianity? Why do they
Yep, this is
claim,
being a good person.
identify?
It's just being a good person. So, yes, so it is mostly, God wants me to mostly be a good person out in the world. God knows I will not be perfect.
They acknowledge that there is a God.
Yes, they acknowledge that they are. That 51% are totally people. Yes. So the people who say they're Christian, we would assume it's a triune God. We would assume they're not heretics. They probably can't communicate that very well for a lot of them. But it would be somebody who associates.
There are a lot of people who
Yeah.
claim that they're
But
organized.
that 51% I was talking about claim to be Christian. In the greater United States, over 70% of people claim to believe there is a God. It's like 75% of people say there's a God or a spiritual force or something. So the vast majority of people are not atheistic.
I don't put all of the responsibility for this wandering away or never having been introduced to it on the parents. I think that the church has a lot of responsibility. I know of a Lutheran church where the elders refer to the team is referred to as shepherds, and they each have assigned families.
Sure.
And if you are not in the pew, they're calling you on Monday morning to find out, were you ill, were you out of
Sure.
town? They really follow up, and there's that sense that your absence is noticed, and it's
Yeah.
almost not acceptable. The issue with kids at confirmation, I think, begins in the church when you define
So-
the word confirmation. What
Yeah.
does that mean? It doesn't mean graduation. It means that you are now confirming the faith that your parents and your sponsors
Mm-hmm.
raised you in.
So there's a bit of catch-22 here, as I've consider some of these things, because if you look at it, confirmation has ended up being like most schooling, which is that it's just gotten easier over the last, like the requirements, like how many times you can miss, like what the questioning in front of the congregation looks like, what the expectations are in class period, right? And a lot of this has to do with, again, it's kind of a catch-22 about friendliness in the church. So you wouldn't want confirmation to be so difficult that people choose not to do it, right? That would be that's one hand. We wouldn't want to push people away from the church because the confirmation requirements are so high. We would rather have them here. The reality is that percentage capture of people you have by making the requirements lower, by reducing it to not really meaning much, to everybody who gets confirmed who might just leave the church as soon as confirmation is over, is having essentially the same result as pushing them away. It's a real, because I think one of the solutions to like what you're saying would be that you actually don't confirm children of parents who are not regularly attending, kick their kid at the curb of confirmation class, or who are probably, you have every indication in the world that they're not going to keep coming to church afterwards. But that goes against everything we feel about, well, am I kicking them away from the proclamation of the gospel and the sacraments now? For what reason? It's a very difficult balance for that. The same thing is true, and this is where it requires like you can't have a catch-all rule for this kind of stuff. It requires like your pastor. This is why we call specific pastors to specific congregations to deal with this. Because if I just went to like every Lutheran church in Orange County and said, you need to make confirmation requirements more difficult, that is not going to work the same in every one of those contexts. Or you need to be less afraid of people leaving because you guys do something different or require more, or this is harder, or you're less friendly, or whatever. I do think in a lot of terms that would be decent advice, but the outcomes can really be that the people who say, well, now you are putting a blockade, an unnecessary blockade that is not in Scripture in front of hearing the proclamation of the gospel, also have a fair point. And so it's a kind of a difficult thing where personally, I feel that way. I actually feel like there have been lots of people confirmed in Lutheran churches for decades who probably just shouldn't have gone through confirmation. Because it was obvious and there were reasons to know that they weren't going to follow through on that. But at the same time, you have to ask, was there more harm in confirming them and trying for those 5 years or 4 years or whatever that period of time was, for trying to break through to evangelizing, to teaching and preaching the gospel to them, despite that the household didn't have the recipe for success behind it, than just removing them from hearing and learning that altogether? And that's kind of the difficult thing, because I actually think you have to be willing to proclaim that word even on rocky soil. We don't decide where to sow the seed. The parable of the sower doesn't teach us a formula to election, but it does teach us that the gospel goes out to even people who won't end up believing it. And so if we become sort of the gardener who goes, well, I don't really like that soil, and stop preaching it to it, it becomes equally steep. Yeah, I mean, I would probably be in favor in a lot of cases for not, but I actually think it's just so personal. Like, it'd be easy for one person to look at a family and go, it's obvious they're going to leave, and for another person to say, it's not obvious to me. I just think that's the role of your pastor and your congregation in those families and his discretion with those families. I do think a lot of pastors do not feel empowered to make those decisions in their congregations anymore, because they're sort of at the mercy of people in the congregation who would feel ill about that kind of thing. But yeah, I think that's the discretion in the job of your pastor. You have called somebody to be the shepherd of this flock for reasons like that. Yeah.
I've overheard a lot of fake Christians go to places to get Christians, and even when I minister on the beach, I see Muslims who marry people. They don't tell them before they get married or have children that they are Muslim, and then after they have child or marry the person, oh, I'm a Muslim. So it's happening all over the place now. We need to teach people, all age groups, to pray together, and parents to pray with
Yeah. So no, I think you. I mean, I know this is one of those ones where there's probably where the point of it is more to leave you with questions than not. This is something that I think is meant for a Bible study like this versus preaching. This is the kind of thing that I think we consider church attendance, talk about these kind of demographic issues, so that it is not the object of the pulpit per se. Because as I started to begin with, it is sort of a ridiculous sermon premise when you're talking about all the non-attenders in the room. And I've experienced it before and things like that too. And so this is, I don't know, gatherings like this are one of the reasons why that other subtitle that you brought up, why your church needs you. Well, your church needs you because of things like that. The gatherings like these kinds of Saturday mornings happen because there are members of this congregation willing to come here and learn on this second Saturday of the month regularly, to organize it, to give their time, to make it happen, to converse with each other, and things like that. And this contributes to a church life which is sort of full, open, conversed openly. And that's, again, we know one of the parts of this is that it's not personal. It's openly talked about, both for children in the home and both in our lives, such that it is one of the substantial and most important things that happens in our life. Yeah.
I mean, this is what we struggle with, and this is exactly the issues that we face as a congregation. It's not just about, getting as many people at the service as you can, but it's how do you best shepherd the flock, and how, I mean, as you say, many people are in many different situations, but we see it all along that you have, some kids when they're confirmed, and that's the last time you
Yeah.
see them, and you struggle. How do you develop a college, high school groups, and how do you get kids to be, continue to be interested? And we struggle with that because you're right. A lot of it is on the parents while they're still under their control, and then when they're out and about and they're more independent and they're on their own, how do you still, proclaim the gospel?
Yeah.
And
A congregation can't control all this. I mean, a lot of this is personal in your household kind of situation, right? So that's you can't really force other people's kids to go to church. You can make a relationship with them, and you can do those kinds of things. You can be on the types of terms where you're in a type of open relationship with other people. But some of this is really sort of like a me and my household kind of effect. What can I do for me, my children, my grandchildren? Can I see any of this in the lives of the people that I have immediate influence over? Because we don't have immediate influence over everybody in our congregation. And so that's where I think a lot of, again, like, this is also, self-reported data. Like, people could say that they would go to church if X, Y, and Z would happen and then not do it. All right, that's kind of the problem with self-reported polling data. It's sort of like exit polls, and then all of a sudden an election is like completely opposite what the exit polls were, and something like that. But it at least gives you some signal of general things which have been important, and general things which I think we can look around and say, okay, that was not the most important thing. And maybe it was to the core group who's been here, right? So like maybe you have a church and you go like, well, the church has declined because 50% of people didn't bring their kids to church regularly, but the people who are still here are probably the 50% who did, right? And it just sort of naturally filters itself out. And then what we know is that to reach the people who are lost, there's like one thing that promises to build faith. It's not that you're going to like convince them, but that you're going to proclaim the faith back into their life. That's that extra nos. And your pastor can't be the only person in your congregation to be willing and educated and comfortable preaching the gospel, is the other thing with this. If you feel like if somebody was going to ask you a question about the faith and you couldn't answer it or preach it, it's time to meet with your pastor and get some help. Does that make sense? Like if you feel like I wouldn't be able to, I don't think I'd be able to preach that to somebody. I don't know where that verse is, or I don't know what that is. That's your sign to get a little education going, or re-education going in your life, because you may at any time be confronted with the opportunity where you hear somebody's confession of sin and need to proclaim Christ into them, or you hear some objection to the faith that maybe you're the only person with an opportunity for who knows how long to just say something and to feel comfortable doing that. Yeah, you had a question?
Well, I was just going to say, one of the things I hear too is that it's wrong to emphasize attendance as a measure of church success.
Yeah.
That kind of thing too.
I kind of agree with that because attendance can be manipulated by all sorts of mechanisms as well. Like we know there are well-attended churches that are attended for really bad reasons for that. Like some of the biggest churches, 10, 15,000 people in the building on Sunday, and they're really there for a concert, right? Kind of situation. Is that are there things we could do in our congregations to maximize the number of people here on a Sunday morning? Probably. Would they all be the best thing? Is another question.
So what you're talking about is the idea of always being ready to make a defense?
Oh,
That's what they do?
yeah, it's almost like, it's almost like there's a verse about that.
Well, I think it also emphasizes how much we are all ministers of the gospel.
Yeah.
We can't just say, well, that's your job. It's all of our jobs.
Yeah, and also different ways in which you can get help and have a relationship with your pastor as well. That's one of those things that I've been trying to say to people is a lot of Christians do not feel comfortable speaking about the faith with other people because they're afraid they're going to get stumped somewhere in the conversation. If that's you, if only there was somebody that you've been a part of a network of people that call to gather around who can help you learn how to do that. Oh, there he is. That's the kind of situation that we.
You should never be afraid that you can't answer the question.
Yeah, or be able to say, I don't know the answer to that question, but I can find it.
That's a good teacher. I don't know.
Yeah, like that's the kind of thing. Because it turns out a lot of like anti-Christian rhetoric is pretty much gotcha, facetious questions as well. A lot of it is not like legitimate concern. It's often people, just like Christians can memorize verses that back them up on whatever they want to do, non-Christians who are argumentative or whatever can memorize whatever kind of talking point that they don't have any experience with or proof with, that they just have heard or seen online debunks Christianity. So it's the same kind of thing to just know when that's happening even, when the conversation isn't like really legitimate anymore.
Yeah, and if you're Christian, then you want to go to church every Sunday to have communion and get the Lord's Supper. In my mind, you can't really call yourself a Christian if you're not going to church and not having communion.
Yeah, I think like the desire to say, I don't really need to do X, Y, and Z thing if I'm a Christian is really problematic. We see it with baptism really frequently too. You will have Christians who are baptized, who are just from traditions that, for instance, don't baptize babies. And they will ask you, well, do I need to be baptized to be saved? I don't know. Are you baptized? And like 9 times out of 10, they are. Because guess what? Every Orthodox Christian tradition on the planet baptizes people. There isn't one that doesn't baptize people. There are plenty who don't baptize infants, but there aren't any that just strictly don't baptize people. So when they ask the question, do I need to be baptized to be saved? Well, you baptize people. This is like you're not asking if I can get away without being baptized. You're trying to make a point about the efficacy of it delivering saving faith to an infant, which is a different conversation than do I need to be baptized? Since, good sir, you are baptized, is kind of, you have to realize there's a different type of question than the one they're actually, or issue than the one they're actually kind of raising.
Question changes it from law to gospel or gospel to law.
Yeah, exactly.
What have to be versus,
Yeah, are you challenging God is one of the ones I have to that. Like, you're like, he promised he would do something for you, and you're like, well, let's see it,
There's something deeply ironic about a denomination named after a thing that denies the things important.
Yeah, that's true.
I just find that fun.
Yeah. Yeah, but
In the Catholic Church, when I
Or
was
that it
young,
does anything.
the
Yeah.
Catholic nuns taught us too, you can baptize somebody, if somebody's dying in their home, you can baptize them, And as a single mom taking care of my mom more than the rest of my life, this old man in church always tell my son, hey Victor, listen to your mother. The young people need old people, to
Yeah.
If you listen to your mother, thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Lord. So they all need that song.
Yeah, and I don't know, as you get older, come to church when you're dying, please. Like I mean it. Like as long as you can. Like be an encumbrance on the rest of this congregation, please, for goodness sake. That's one of those things too as we get older, is to not believe the church doesn't need us anymore. We'd just be in the way. Like just be that example in a lot of ways. Be present. Be the burden on people. The Christian life is made up of vocations, and having vocations means that somebody else's burdens are placed on you, and that we place our burdens on other people. And that's kind of the point of being like one family united in Christ, is to have burdens shared across the whole body. So it's really sad when people amongst us, tell us they don't come to church because they might be a burden. Yep. All right. Well, with that cheering in.
Thank you very much, Caleb, for that insightful conversation.
Thank you.
Next month, we will not have a Sunday, the second Saturday. It'll be a third Saturday instead. Just to mix things up again. It'll be Pastor Dr. Skirbo, I'm saying that wrong probably.
St. Paul.
St. Paul, whatever it is.
We know you have.
I'm not going to, my mind is grasping. But anyway, it'll be a spirited conversation, and I hope all you can come.